This is the InfoWars Nightly News. I'm Aaron Dykes.
And I'm Melissa Melton. Agenda 21 is not a conspiracy theory. And while it may seem harmless or even helpful on the surface, it is a UN-inspired, banker-funded scheme to institute a global government from the ground up. Right here, right now, our country is being taken over in the name of sustainable development.
Local environmental groups are meeting in towns across America backed by big federal grant money, but behind that, entities like the Rockefeller Foundation. Their sustainable community meetings are not only a takeover, but a buy-in to a planned society controlled by a psychopathic elite, all sold with a smile. So to find out more, we decided to investigate some of those local meetings taking place in Texas to find out about the dark deception behind this Agenda 21 scheme.
They had growth on them so quickly and so heavily they didn't have time to plan.
What is sustainable development?
The conservation of energy resources.
People that live there maybe don't have to drive as much.
Concentrated and balanced growth.
Concentrated and balanced growth.
And the kind of growth you want to see.
To help you achieve the vision.
Higher density mixed-use development in the center of town.
How compact or not is it? Creating this much more interconnected grid.
Growth here is more balanced.
Housing and jobs balance with the stakeholder committee's participation in line with the Sustainable Places Project.
The Housing and Urban Development Department of the United States awarded Sustainable Communities Regional Planning grants to Texas, giving $3.7 million to the Capital Area Council of Governments in a project that spanned Austin, Texas, as well as neighboring rural communities that include Elgin, Lockhart, Hutto, and Dripping Springs. The grant specifies guidelines for energy use and climate change mitigation, as well as the integration of smart housing, nearby job sectors, and integrated transportation systems. The members of the project we spoke with in Elgin were apparently unaware of HUD's related agenda to the larger Agenda 21 program.
Agenda what?
Agenda 21.
What's the number stand for?
21st century.
And what does that mean?
You can look it up on the internet.
I'm not familiar with it at all, so I couldn't comment on that. So I'm not sure what their criteria or their outline is on that.
Respectfully, there is no national treaty that obligates local governments to follow Agenda 21. That just doesn't exist. That's a myth.
We're promoting sustainable, responsible development. But it's nothing to do with the United Nations. I mean, you know, if that's just paranoia. I'm sorry.
In fact, there is an international agenda at work. Austin is a model city for the ICLEI. The NGO partnered with the United Nations to push for local Agenda 21 implementation. In the name of sustainability, they've taken on some of the most ambitious carbon cuts in the entire nation and are a model for energy conservation and zero waste. And unelected regional boards are drawing the rest of Central Texas into this international scheme, all in the name of sustainability. Among other groups, Smart Growth America and the ICLEI Local Governments for Sustainability USA Group specifically congratulated the cities and towns receiving these HUD grants for sustainable communities and regional planning. So it is absurd to claim that there is no international agenda interacting with these local communities as they attempt to implement sustainable development goals.
Well, I know a lot about Agenda 21, and I don't have any concerns because I don't think this project is driven by the international community or even by the national community. I think it's driven by Elgin, Texas.
Except it's been implemented nationally under treaty and these grants are coming from the federal level. I think it's really dishonest not to admit there's an Agenda 21 motive.
Sustainability is just about letting local communities decide for themselves.
We had heard so much about what Agenda 21 wasn't, we decided to interview a professor that teaches it. This is Dean Almy, an associate professor and director of graduate programs in urban design and landscape architecture at the University of Texas.
Now in Texas, Texas Triangle is one of the 10 identified megaregions of the United States. And the projections, which were pretty much just confirmed by the recent census data that was released, are that populations in the Texas Triangle will double in the next 20 to 30 years. And one of the big problems, of course, is that it starts to create new towns, new communities, but are they really communities? Are they really towns when they're all sort of evolving in a really short time.
He teaches Agenda 21 courses at the university.
So the course I teach, which I call Agenda 21, really deals with the question of sustainable urbanism. How do we begin to sort of build the city more sustainably moving forward?
What is Agenda 21, kind of a brief overview, and why you feel that it's an important plan?
Well, it was a resolution of the United Nations where a number of countries got together, ostensibly in Rio, also called the Rio Declaration, to begin to look at the way in which humans were occupying the world, the state of the world, the state of civilization in the world, how we were using resources, whether the consumption of resources and global development was being achieved ecologically and equitably.
And when recently asked about the UN's plan by a San Antonio-based news station, he was quoted as saying, "It's changing the status quo of how we operate as a country that is developing, and so it's threatening to some people. Urban design by its nature is about the collective good and isn't necessarily about the freedom of any one person to do whatever the hell they want." So I was going to ask you if you wanted to talk about that quote a little bit.
Well, I mean, already, if we're looking for code words, okay, so already in that quote is the term collective, which, a conspiracy theorist could somehow associate with, I don't know, the Soviet Union, right? And that's not the intent. Collective just means us together as a society. So yeah, I kind of stand behind that, actually. Cities are not individual constructs built by single people. Cities are collective constructs where we all live together, and we have to balance the needs of individuals and the needs of collective society. And cities, by their very nature, would be very difficult to construct and manage and develop if they were all sort of politically anarchic.
Agenda 21's Sustainable Development Visioning meetings rely on the Delphi technique, a manipulation tactic wherein a facilitator ensures a public forum goes as planned with the predetermined outcome already decided upon by those who ultimately called the meeting. The Delphi technique was created by the Rand Corporation in the 1950s for the U.S. Department of Defense to use as a psychological weapon during the Cold War. While community feedback is encouraged, the final outcome is driven by leading questions and preset answers. Notice in this presentation how your participation automatically equals acceptance. These same exact strategies were outlined in detail in the local Agenda 21 handbook. We saw this at both sustainable development meetings we attended. No matter what answer a community member chose, it all fed into the Agenda 21 plan already underway. The project planners admitted they weren't working with a blank slate, but were instead following a plan already mapped out by so-called stakeholders.
What we want to be really clear about is that we're not starting from sort of an empty slate. Your community has done a lot of work in setting in place lots of plans and policies like the comprehensive plan.
We're planners. We've been involved in projects mostly in central Austin and around that area. We worked on the Miller redevelopment for many years, and we're still working on it. The Downtown Austin Plan. We're working on several master plan communities around the region. A lot of focus on urban infill and redevelopment.
Jen, have you ever heard of Agenda 21?
Yes, but just recently.
Is this a part of that plan?
No.
Is it affiliated in any way?
No.
The reason I ask is because you use a lot of the same terminology, visioning workshops and sustainable development, and a lot of that falls under that plan, and I just didn't know.
That is very traditional planning talk from the last probably 30 years. So we always talk about, having a vision. What is the general big picture vision?
But there's a larger agenda going on. I mean, this is a regional development. It didn't start here in Elgin. These proposals didn't originate here in Elgin. They're being done in other cities.
I think these proposals did originate here in Elgin.
Why are all these plans springing up all at once at the same exact time, all over the country, all over every city, though, if it's not a coordinated effort?
Well, I don't want to be contentious with you. I would just say that I think that's a myth. They're not springing up all over the country. In this whole region, there's 4 cities looking at it.
In fact, these sustainable communities were popping up in nearly every major metro area across the country, all funded by HUD. And these sustainable communities are pursuing the international agenda under President Obama's Partnership for Sustainable Communities, joining together the policies and regulations of housing and urban development, the Department of Traffic, and the EPA.
I actually went to my first Sustainable Development meeting last week. They received a federal grant from Obama's Partnership for Sustainable Communities, and they seem to use a lot of the same language in Agenda 21. I didn't know if you knew about those sustainable meetings that have been happening around here and if those are somehow connected.
Well, there are a number of layers of sustainability. I mean, almost to the point where the term itself is sort of overused. But here at the School of Architecture, we have a Center for Sustainable Development, which does get grants from foundations, sometimes from federal government, usually from philanthropic foundations. And they are a clearinghouse for a whole series of different initiatives.
Texas has been faced with so-called smart growth proposals for well over a decade now. For years, bureaucrats in the Texas area laughed in the faces of activists, even as they gave passionate speeches defying the implementation of toll roads and other unnecessary infrastructure already owned by the state of Texas and its citizens. Instead, unelected regional boards like Campo moved the measures forward as best they could, while insiders who amounted to little more than thieves skimmed off the top and made millions off of secret deals. And yet we see some of the same regional players pushing for further development in the name of sustainability.
The Central Texas Vision for Growth was directed by CAPCOG, Trust for Public Land, and Envision Central Texas. These entities, in turn, are shaped and steered by countless environmental groups controlled and funded by the Rockefeller Foundation, the Ford Foundation, George Soros, and Ted Turner, among others. Their alignment with Agenda 21 is well documented. Sustainable development was coined by the United Nations to mask a covert takeover at the local level. Land conservation and smart growth planning have been used to subsidize insiders, allowing development to be hijacked while the system picks winners and losers, reaping the profits at our expense.
Everything in green is the protected area. So you see there's not really much protected areas 15 years ago. 2 years ago, this is the work that we did. All this land was purchased by cities or by the city of Austin or the county, and we use our funds and our political clout to encourage the city to purchase these lands for protection.
Has any of that been developed on?
Yes. So this does not mean there's no development. What it means is that the development is done in a sustainable and ecologically friendly way.
By implementing Agenda 21, it's a local implementation, it's from the bottom up kind of thing, that by putting all of these regulations environmentally and putting them on the urban areas that are usually the economic centers for cities, that you're sort of picking winners and losers in a way, because you're saying that only people who will adhere to these things are allowed to develop, and so there's kind of a bigger agenda there with that. I don't know what your thoughts are on that.
I would turn it around a little bit, and I would say, I don't know that we're picking winners or losers. This is not a kind of environmental nepotism that's going on. I mean, but I think it's a mistake to think that rules don't already exist everywhere.
The United Nations has made its anti-private property stance abundantly clear. Quote, "Land cannot be treated as an ordinary asset controlled by individuals. Private land ownership is also a principal instrument of accumulation and concentration of wealth and therefore contributes to social injustice. The provision of decent dwellings and healthy conditions for the people can only be achieved if land is used in the interest of society as a whole."
First of all, we have to believe that humans need to live kind of symbiotically with the earth, that we're not here to dominate the earth. You know, when the United States was founded, and many of the original sort of authors and thinkers who wrote about, society in the U.S. and people like Thoreau, for example. There was a sort of idea that the U.S. was this great wilderness, that we could just go out and sort of settle the wilderness and be pioneers and live on our own and be independent. And I don't think it's like that anymore. I mean, there's very little wilderness left in the United States.
Sustainable development is the philosophy designed to bring human beings across the globe under the full control of a narrow human elite.
It's a 40-chapter document to basically control the world. It's based entirely on socialist control mechanisms.
Sustainable developers have designed a global movement coordinated through a global to local action plan to create world government in accordance with certain objectives. An end to national sovereignty, the abolition of private property, the restructure of the family unit, and increasing limitations and restrictions on mobility and individual opportunity.
Professor Almy admitted plans to restrict travel were ecologically necessary, and his contempt for the family and Western civilization was thinly veiled.
You know, the suburbs bring with them their own kind of tyranny, right? One is public space is almost non-existent in terms of real public space. There's lots of lawn, right? But real collective public space. There's the tyranny, I would argue, of you know, the nuclear family, and not that that's tyranny in itself, it's not, but the wife having to drive their kids to everything, having to drop your kids off at school, having to pick your kids up at school, having to drive them to Little League, everything is about one member of a family having to basically play a support role while another member works. And everything is sort of geared that way, and it's actually quite expensive. So things like the automobile and the amount of infrastructure that families use to economically to support living in an environment dominated by patterns that are automobile dependent is a big problem.
This is an Agenda 21 map that claims that that is what, if Agenda 21 was fully implemented, the United States would look like. I don't know if you've ever seen that.
I haven't seen this map before.
And this is something that opponents have said is the ultimate plan of Agenda 21. I didn't know if you had heard of this map or seen it before.
I haven't seen the map before, but I know where some of the principles behind the map come from. It's trying to kind of suggest that if we were to develop networks of water, networks of plant habitat, networks of animal habitat, networks of human habitat, how would these networks begin to interact? What areas would need to be preserved from development?
There is a pretty great fear of this. I found a lot out there of
you bet.
This plan. And
yeah.
that it really will somehow end property rights, people's personal property rights, that it will end national sovereignty eventually, and give it up to a whole global entity now that will kind of take control over everything. And that's kind of the general consensus.
You know what will end national sovereignty faster than some fictitious conspiracy based on a United Nations declaration? Major ecological catastrophe. You know? And you know, to be honest, in my opinion, I think one has to come to terms with the fact that such things as global warming exist. If you don't believe global warming exists, or if you believe that man is on this planet to dominate the world, then you don't care about these things.
It should be noted that the professor admitted to democratic socialist leanings once the cameras were off, and that his father worked for the CIA, as evidenced by a paperweight he displayed on his desk during the interview. While he talked in circles on many concepts and seemed to contend that he knew what was best for humanity, he refused to acknowledge any nefarious motives behind Agenda 21.
Most of the people here in Elgin don't know or care what Agenda 21 is. I don't care what Agenda 21's agenda is.
Think about it. These local planners are trying to concentrate smart growth in small towns of barely 15,000 people in the second largest state in the nation, encompassing hundreds of miles of empty land. In fact, experts have even come forward to say that the world's entire population of 7 billion could fit here in Texas comfortably with no problem. It doesn't make any sense. But make no mistake, what does make sense is that these local sustainable development meetings are nothing more than a green mask trying to hide a global takeover in plain sight.
Takeover doesn't even begin to explain it. There really are no words for this level of evil and greed. These are just front groups we've analyzed in the video today. But when you look at the real players behind them, the bankers, the people with connections to families like the Rockefellers, you begin to understand the true corruption, the real nature of evil, where mega wealth aligns with an agenda to destroy humanity and control our future for their gain. For the InfoWars Nightly News, I'm Aaron Dykes.
And I'm Melissa Melton.